Yeah, it's really bizarre. Back in December, there was some talk about an economic upheaval. Little did I know that this would be so stark.
Yeah.
Okay, so why don't we get started? We are beaming live on Facebook, and this is a reality check for Rishi. It's Thursday, Tech Thursday. This is actually our 8th week of being hunkered down, but we have been doing these daily podcasts talking about coronavirus issues from different standpoints, business or healthcare. And today, obviously, it's technology. So let's talk a little bit about where we are situated today. And, the coronavirus has essentially created some unemployment numbers that we're looking at. It's pretty stark. It has unemployment is surging to 14.7%. And we are now talking about that Great Depression. So when President FDR, when he was talking to America about the only thing you have to fear is fear itself. And we are actually looking at that era to see, how we'll compare and contrast with that Great Depression. And I was looking at some economic indicators, and apparently there might be some errors in terms of how the government is calculating the unemployment. So that number, if you adjust it, it actually stands at 23.6%, which is not very far from the peak of the depression, which is about 25.9%. And the Labor Department said Friday that 20.5 million jobs, 20.5 million jobs vanished in 1 month. And when you compare the Great Depression, if I remember that correctly, it was about 14 million jobs lost in a month. So this is like really drastic what's going on. And so there are shutdowns happening, factories, stores, offices, businesses, and the number of persons that who are working part-time, number of people who are working part-time, it's actually about 10.9 million. So a lot more folks who are not able to find full-time jobs are going part-time. So it's a pretty unfortunate story that's playing out. And we are all sort of figuring out, trying to see the light at the end of the tunnel. And in California, mostly everybody's at stage 2 with some relief. And unfortunately, the county that we live in, which is Santa Clara County, we are still at stage 1 because we apparently have a lot of cases. So let's look at the numbers. Worldwide, we are at 4.5 million total cases, 1.7 million recovered, and about 303,000 deaths, what we have seen worldwide. And if you look at the United States, we are currently at 86,000 deaths. And if you go back to April, and I'm looking at my chart here, if you look at just about maybe like 3 weeks back, we were at about 50,000 deaths, and we have gone to 86,000 deaths in about 3 weeks. So the number seemingly is not really fading away for us. We are currently 1.4 million cases, and back on April 23rd, we had 860,000 cases. If you look at Santa Clara County, there is some good news, basically. The number of patients hospitalized is going down. So that number is a key indicator of progression. And many states actually looked at pretty actively, like the state of New York, they published that number. And in the county, we actually published that number, but I haven't seen the ability to track it from week to week. But I've been maintaining that data. And that number has gone down from 113 patients that were hospitalized last week to 84. So that's is definitely good news for us in terms of how we are dealing with this. Now, there are quite a few facilities where we are testing for coronavirus, and it's also free testing. So let's talk about the different spots where you can get it. So one is in Gilroy and one in San Jose. At the Santa Clara Fairgrounds in San Jose, you can get free testing, and also at the San Jose PAL Stadium. And then you have James Lake High School in San Jose at the Alum Rock Avenue location, and also Christopher High School in Gilroy. So you have free testing, and you just have to sort of make sure that you get yourself validated through the system, and you can get that free testing going. So with that, let's talk about tech. And today we have a very special guest. And what we have been talking about on Thursday is in spite of all these ongoings with health and coronavirus and testing and data that seems to fluctuate positive, negative in terms of, yes, you should do this or no, you shouldn't do it. Lots of confusion, but the constant here is technology here in Silicon Valley. And so we will end up talking a little bit about tech and how this landscape is evolving in a post-COVID-19 world. Obviously, we are the 19th largest economy in the United States. We power the economy not only of the United States, but also of the world. And so we look at tech very seriously compared to probably, Silicon Valley is perceived as geeks, and we pride ourselves. Every geek is a rock star here. And not to say that Manik is a geek, he's uber cool. Oh, actually, he used to work for Uber. And so let's introduce Manik. He moved from entrepreneurship to the massive supply chain of HP to the top of Google India, and now and then at Uber. And it's been an amazing career progression. When I was looking at his bio that our team members put together. He is one of those technologists who lives to eliminate frustration. And Manik is currently an advisor, investor in startups based in the US and also India. So he works globally. And he worked as we all know, perhaps, as chief product officer at Uber, and where he led the global core product team as part of the executive team. And he was responsible for 1,100-person organization, spanning product management, data science, data analyst, design and program management functions. And prior to the leadership role at Uber Marketplace, he was actually at the Uber Marketplace and Maps product teams. He essentially ran this team, and he was responsible for creating best-in-class mapping solutions and marketplace technologies. And prior to that, he was at Google Maps. And it was very interesting because I was reading one of his stories, and apparently the very first week at Google India, his boss came up to him and said, Manik, what project should we look at? And he said, look, here is this map project that nobody's working on. And it's like a golden nugget fell upon Manik. And so, if you go back to, he grew up in India, spent many years in Singapore, where he founded an e-commerce company that was eventually acquired. So he's a serial entrepreneur, as we call it, living the Silicon Valley dream now that he's here. And he studied engineering at Nanyang Technological University, Singapore, and he received an MBA from the Indian School of Business in Hyderabad, India. So Manik, welcome. Hopefully I did an adequate job of your introduction, because we can fill up a lot of different words, because you have done well in the world of technology. You have really, like I said, living that dream. So let's talk about shelter in place today as we look at the world of coronavirus. How are you dealing with that? And, have you been making some introspective decisions as you shelter in place, or how are you pivoting? Would you like to share some stories on that?
Yeah. Hey, so in the beginning, I'll say, Rishi, thank you so much for having me on this channel. And I must give credit to your team and you to having done good research in terms of my background. And I appreciate you sharing that. So thanks for that. So I think, as you covered in your opening remarks, this is obviously a very, very unprecedented time for everybody. I'm based in the Santa Clara County myself, and every day I follow the Santa Clara County Twitter account, and they publish a dashboard on how many cases and unfortunate deaths that are happening. And it's just amazing to me that despite the fact that we have been in shelter in place for almost coming to 2 months now, we still have a situation where we haven't really gotten a full control on the situation. So clearly the virus is among us, and we have to continue to practice all the safety aspects that the county and everybody else is talking about. So in terms of what I've been up to, so for me, I left Uber in January of this year, and my perspective at that time was to take a break and just spend time with family and learn new skills, if you will. And honestly, I didn't realize that the whole world, I guess nobody realized that the world is going to completely change in just a couple of months. So for me, a few things, as I've been thinking through, a lot of the time that I have with my family right now, and just looking at different sort of aspects, One thing that's been very interesting for me is just that deepening connection with friends and family. And now, with tools like Zoom, there is something different about doing a video conference with friends and family versus just a WhatsApp chat or a phone call. I think nobody really calls people anymore, right? As we all know, but we do send a lot of WhatsApp messages and other sort of messages and so on. But then the fact that you can get people together on video, and especially if you have a bunch of different friends in different locations you haven't caught up with. So my wife and I and my son, we have been doing a lot of that, and it's been really nice to reconnect with people, right? And as they say about deep friendships, they basically pick up from where you left off, right? So it's not like anything kind of really changed. Like you still have the same jokes, you still have the same sort of connection. So that's been very interesting. The second thing I'd say is scheduling things has become much easier. I don't know your experience, Rishi, but nobody has an excuse. Like if I have to get a meeting with somebody, I mean, where are they? They're sitting at home, right? They're not traveling anywhere. They're not, doing a commute, or they're pretty much there at home. So it's much easier to find time to just connect, and you don't have to book things week in advance, right, or weeks in advance. You're just ping each other and say, yeah, I have some time. I'm bored. Let's just talk. So that's been an interesting kind of habit, and the more spontaneous communication and connection, I feel is just helping things move along. And finally, one of the goals that I had was to just start looking after my health a little bit better, because I've been on a pretty intense journey at Uber, and in this, both my wife and particularly my son have been pushing me a lot. So I've started doing some runs. I've started going on a run with my son. And obviously he's much fitter than I am, so I have to kind of keep up with him. But it's just one of those activities that I'm just thoroughly enjoying right now. So those are some of the new aspects that I've picked up, at least in the last few months.
Yes, very nice. Thank you for sharing. And I see that your better half, Nidhi, is here. Nidhi,
yeah,
would you like
on the call too.
jump in and say hi? Chime in?
I don't know if she might not actually be there.
Okay, got it. Okay. So let's keep going. I totally agree. I think it's seemingly like as if time has come to a halt, sort of, even though we are all pretty busy. But it seems like we have gone back in time, like 50 years. We have all this technology around us, but it's a very different world. It feels like a little, kind of like a little weird, to be in this situation. And like you said, you ping folks and everybody's calendars are pretty open, and it's just like we wonder how we dealt with that, and relationships, like our batchmates, undergrad batchmates, we met over Zoom for the very first time, actually, and strangely we had never had a reunion. So it was the very first meeting on Zoom that we had, and which was also, like you said, the same exact jokes, as if we had never quite left off. I mean, it just continued, and it was pretty amazing. But this is the time, I think, we're all sort of getting a reality check in terms of, how we function in the world, and how we will want to function in the next few years. Because I believe that there will be a transformative shift in terms of the mindsets of people. And I don't think so we have truly seen that yet. And we are still coming to grips. And the real madness will happen once we open up the economy and as we get back. And that's when we'll actually see the starkness of the picture that lies ahead of us. And that will create that mind shift. When you look at the unemployment numbers, it's just like, oh my God, who would have thought that this would happen back in like January? I remember watching a video in December, I think, and it was from Wuhan. And it looked like a scary movie, because folks were standing in the balconies of the skyscrapers and screaming into an empty street. Was like in the right in the middle of urban paradise. There was so much emptiness, and it was like, wow, how can that happen? No way. I mean, I couldn't even fathom that this very same thing would happen here in the United States as well. So the world has definitely changed, and we have to reconcile and adapt to a new world. And interestingly, one of the things that I saw a TEDx talk, which was sent to me, people have a lot more time. They're sending stuff that you can sit and watch also.
Right.
And this was about adaptability. You talk about IQ or EQ, and this is AQ, and which is basically that the ability for people to unlearn, and which is what is going to happen. I think many of us will have to deal with a different set of circumstances. and we'll have to unlearn what we knew of the world in the past. And the ones who are likely to succeed are the ones who will unlearn quick and create that new learning for a new world. And we can sort of see that happening. So let's stay with coronavirus. Let's talk about you had a very successful stint at Uber as the chief product officer. And when you look at Uber, I don't know if you would like to talk about it, but perhaps you would share a few things about Uber. But in context of how coronavirus is impacting companies, and I saw something on Twitter the other day where folks were talking about will we ever take an Uber again? And when you look at how would Uber be impacted by an ultra cautious consumer that is leery of going to a gas station and picking up that handle, or going to walking into a store, right? What about walking into a stranger's car? So how would you see how would you see that world? Not so much in context of Uber, but in context of how you will see that shift happening and how companies will be reconciling to that.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent question. So I feel that, I mean, if you let me actually start with Uber itself, just to kind of set some context. So if you look at the recent earnings report from Uber, clearly Dara Khosrowshahi, who's the CEO, mentioned that the rides business, the ride-sharing business, is down significantly, right? And Uber also has an Eats business, which is the other, counter cyclical, if you will, because there's a massive increase in people sitting at home and ordering food through Uber Eats. So I think as a company, I do feel that whether over time, as the behavior changes, as people are becoming more wary, as you said, about taking Ubers and so on. But I think as a company, it's kind of well balanced because there is an Eats business there, which can potentially still help the company move forward. So, I think that Dara is making very tough decisions, but I think those decisions are needed to move the company forward. So I think that's all I would say about Uber in this context. I think the general question that you asked is a very interesting one, which is it's fascinating to see from my perspective how consumer behavior changes over time, right? And this is such a big jolt to everybody that it is getting people, it might leave some scars in people's minds about how they want to go back to work or go back in society. And my perspective on this is, I would argue that people perhaps would be more scared of taking public transit than they would be of taking an Uber. So you would imagine, if you are in a subway where you have a lot of people together, or you are even in a bus, I think initially, at least, as people get back to their daily lives, when work opens up and so on, and that's something we can also talk about, I think people would actually prefer, unless they drive their own car, which might actually end up being the safest thing for them, to drive their own car and park it and then go somewhere. But the next most safest option, I think, in people's mind would be to take an Uber, because you're just with one driver, and as long as both of you are taking safety precautions, which I know both Uber, Lyft, and everybody else is launching right now, I think that would be the way people would go back. Not everybody can afford to drive their own car every day, especially for commute. Of course, not everybody can take an Uber as well, because it's not as affordable sometimes as public transit. But I think in terms of consumer psyche, I think that when the bounce back happens, when the economy starts opening up, when places start opening up, I do feel that a lot of people would gravitate towards that. Now, the other thing interesting is, if you look at travel business in general, right? You look at the when do people start flying again, right? I am pretty bearish on that. I don't know about you, Rishi, but I don't think I'm getting on a flight anytime soon, right? Because unless it is, of course, an emergency or something that I just have to go. And the question is, if there's not going to be enough flights, then there's not going to be enough airport trips, right? So that also impacts a lot of these, companies that are essentially focused on this. So to me, I think, yes, the consumers are going to be very concerned. I think companies are doing whatever they can to bring back safety, if you will. And safety has always been a very high priority for these companies. Just yesterday, I think there were a bunch of announcements that you have to wear a mask when you get into an Uber, and the driver also has to wear a mask. And I think some of those aspects and sanitation and cleaning the handles and everything of the car would just make people safer. But of course, there's always going to be a risk till the time coronavirus is amongst us. So that's kind of my perspective. I think it will bounce back, and it will bounce back faster than public transit in many cases, as long as, affordability, of course, is a question. But that's how I think things will work out.
Yep. So I think you make some excellent points here, Manik. With Dara, he's obviously looking at the immediate, and the Uber Eats is probably going to help, but also the long-term planning. Because I don't see coronavirus there for like 2 years. Will we have a pandemic again at this scale? We will not. So even though we have to look at the tactical problems on hand and make sure that we can survive for the next year, 2 years, 3 years, but at the same time, we have to sort of look through the rubble that we have today and sort of make some smart choices, and which is what companies that will survive and thrive will be doing exactly that. So I can clearly see that many of the Silicon Valley ventures will sort of be looking at how they can make some adjustments, pivoting, and ensure that they are long term, they have a viable solution that will be resonating in the marketplace. So that reminds me, when you look at you obviously spent some time in Singapore, and the pandemic, it was handled a little differently in Singapore because they did some long-term planning. And so here is what happened, right? In the year 2001, we had the SARS epidemic in all over the world, and in Singapore, a lot of the families lost their parents, the seniors, because of the SARS epidemic that was unleashed, and they made some very, very good choices. And so, if you look at the number of coronavirus cases, they have per 1,000 people or per 100. They have done a much better job with all the learning that transpired. So, when you look back in Singapore, and let's talk about cultural issues. For example, when we talk about contact tracing, there is a huge pushback. And apparently, we are hiring a bunch of folks here in California to do some sort of like a manual contact tracing. I know Google already has an application that can be used very effectively for contact tracing with our phones. So I'm not sure if our public sector entities are looking at that or not, but there has been a pushback with that. But now when you look at, Singapore having made some proper choices that has situated them well in a pandemic like this, are there any cultural factors that you see that are different between Singapore and America that sort of positions us not as well in comparison to some of the other countries across the world? Any comments on that?
Yeah, no, I think this is a topic I've been spending a lot of time on. So, I'll give you some thoughts, and if possible, we can go into more details. So just as context, my wife and I, we used to live in Singapore, as you pointed out. And in fact, it was in 2003 when the SARS epidemic hit. And both of us were there in Singapore during that time. And, we went through a tough time. I was actually on a break also at that time, which was
Wow.
kind of interesting. Like my two breaks in my life have kind of coincided with pandemics, which is just bizarre. But I was on break at that time between jobs. And then my wife was working in a company, and she got furloughed. And so both of us were pretty much, we were early in our careers, but we were jobless in Singapore. And we are kind of making things happen, right? Just like I'm sure a lot of people are going through that right now. The interesting thing was I have very, very strong memories of that time because it was unprecedented for a place like Singapore to face something like this. So they rolled out a lot of things which we are seeing right now, right? Like they rolled out temperature check, they rolled out manual contact tracing, whereby wherever you went into any office, firstly, you couldn't go to any office, but if you had to go to some office and if there were some open, there were always sanitizers. You had to sign in your name, you had to put in your phone number, and there was a visitor's kind of record keeping and all that in case, somebody was infected, somebody will call you and things like that. And I think overall, I have to give a lot of credit to the Singapore government. And they learned a lot from that. And they put in tremendous amount of infrastructure and processes and playbooks for whenever the next pandemic happens. So when coronavirus hit Singapore, there was no confusion. It was a playbook, right? It was like clockwork. They knew what they had to do day 1, day 2, day 3, shut down the travel from outside, really start doing contact tracing, have effective testing and tracing and isolation and isolating all the people who have to be in quarantine, which is what we have seen in all other countries that have done a much better job than the United States right now in terms of managing the situation. So they did that. And I think to be fair, they have seen a resurgence. So there's a resurgence of coronavirus in Singapore because I think they also had some blind spots, especially with the migrant population that lives in Singapore, I don't think they did a very good job protecting that population. And that is where the next outburst has happened. But again, they learn from it, they move very fast, they're decisive. And what I also really like about the approach, and I've been following this very closely, is their prime minister and their government in general is very communicative. And they're communicative with very straightforward facts and figures, and not really kind of, trying to, move the ball somewhere else, right? So a lot of that has happened in Singapore, and I think, they have managed it effectively. You do talk a lot about the essentially the kind of the cultural aspects, one thing is, I have in my free time right now, I have recently started working on a project around COVID-19, where I've gotten together with a bunch of about 20 volunteers, among the best engineers and product people and designers that I've worked with, and then we are building a set of solutions to really safely reopen the economy. And without going into a lot of details, because we're going to announce that next week, one of the most important things that we have discovered is that the contact tracing bits, and just generally speaking, how you get the federal, state, and county coordination of the healthcare information flowing is actually pretty broken in the United States. I think this should not come as a surprise to Rishi, to you. You're already very close to this, but a lot of other people. There is a lot of confusion in terms of federal versus state versus county, and companies are also confused in terms of what policies they should follow and so on. So I think that sort of infrastructure, if you will, right, of how to handle a pandemic, how the information needs to flow, how the supply chain needs to work. For instance, in Singapore, from day one, the primary healthcare workers were in full PPE. They had PPE, they had the masks and so on. And even now we hear stories about people not having that. So I think there has definitely been a lot of deltas in terms of how the two countries have managed this. And culturally, I would just say, this is a little bit of a softer point, but in Asia in general, and I saw this in Singapore, and I'm originally from India, there's a little bit of a collectivism outlook where we try to sort of look at putting community first, sometimes over self. And of course, in the United States, it's different, right? It's more individual freedom, civil liberties, and so on and so forth. So I think that also plays a little bit of a cultural context in terms of, people are actually very responsible, of course, in the United States as well. But then I think there are, they don't really want the government to tell them what to do, right? And even if the government tells them that, it's unlikely that they would follow it unless they really believe in it, which I think that's what makes this country special. But at the same time, in events like the pandemic, sometimes someone who lives in a society where you're not only looking out for yourself, you're looking out for your community, I think that can also be an effective way to negate some of the harmful effects. So I think that's kind of my high-level perspective on how the two countries have kind of handled this. And I'm in an interesting position to be able to contrast that, because I've gone through both those aspects so far.
Yeah. So let's dig it a little bit deeper into this. So when you look at Project Baseline, which is basically the online system to verify whether you should get tested or not, and looks like they have really relaxed the algorithm, because I saw a buddy of mine go through the testing, and he presented the results online on social media, and he said, I answered no to everything, and they still wanted me to get tested. So it looks like we are getting a little bit easier with some of the test kits that have freed up. We have a lot more kits. We have a lot more test sites. It took quite some time for us to really get our act together, but seemingly we are, getting this train back on track, if you may call it that. But, when you look at Google Baseline, they actually had to work in partnership with like public health agencies, the California Governor's Office, and the California Department of Public Health. And it seems to me that there is a lot of collaboration that can happen between our public sector and the private sector. And in fact, when you look at, for example, we had this small business webinar that we ran for many, many weeks with the stimulus checks that were being handed out. And it was a big disaster, because with the SBA loans that were being offered, the website was crashing in the first few days. And if they had relied upon a Silicon Valley tech company, if they had just collaborated and teamed up, I think, this is what, companies out here do. That's their expertise, and I don't know who they were working with, but it was a big disaster. Then when you look at PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, which was primarily for small businesses, we discovered that they had to work through a bank. And none of the banks had the act together because we had different methods, mechanisms of how people could be enrolled into that, how they could submit. And apparently some of these were like browser specific, that only if you use this particular browser, then you got, then you were confirmed as having filed through, which is what one of our friends, actually, he'll be arriving shortly, he discovered that, right? So it's very interesting, how bizarre the system was. So why not have more collaboration between the public sector and the private sector? Now, when you look at also the economic stimulus, in terms of, who really needs the money, what sector needs the money to ensure that we can bring this economy back on track? What are the different dials we need to tweak? And really, I think it's sort of done manually with experts, and we probably have a lot of experts, but we are relying upon men. What about our people? Why not create systems that would sort of automatically work with these types of things, instead of trying to painstakingly, look at different options, A, B, C, and sort of, falling all over the place as we move forward. Any comments on that, Manik?
Yeah, I think you bring up a really important point. Just as part of the project that I'm working on, for instance, right now, I'm getting to work with county health departments. And I must tell you, those folks are heroes, right? I have come, we are trying to deploy our project initially in the state of Kansas because one of the co-founders of this project is based there, and he has a lot of connections there. And all these folks are so clear-eyed in terms of what they need to do. And they need a lot of help, to your point, right? They need a lot of tech help in particular. And at the same time, they're completely overwhelmed right now because they are understaffed. So part of the challenge that I've seen, and I've learned this myself in the last couple of months, and again, it's a short time that I've been looking at this, it is hard for them to really understand deeply what the promise the technology can bring. So, and what ends up happening is they essentially end up choosing a vendor or somebody whom they've worked with before, right? And a lot of times these might not be the perfect vendors because they may not have the right skill sets and so on, but they have the familiarity and they don't want to go through the whole process again. So a classic example that I'd give you is what's happening on contact tracing right now. So Google and Apple, about a month ago, roughly, they announced this new API, which is one of the best designs I've ever seen for a privacy-focused API for something like contact tracing, where you have the proximity of one person with another person and so on and so forth. And they have made a decision that the only way they'll deploy this API is through a public-private partnership, right? So a state health department or a county health department, they're the only ones who can kind of commission certain apps that will basically integrate with the Google and Apple API. And I think that you're starting to see those initiatives from companies like Google and Apple, which I think is a really, really good move, because it provides the power of technology. And to be honest, I was actually surprised that Google and Apple collaborated on this, because this is, again, something that you don't see. I used to work at Google, and you don't really see these kind of collaborations happening that often among these big tech giants. So them coming together, providing an API, saying that this has to be government driven, as opposed to them building the apps or somebody else building the apps. I think that's a very clear example of how companies are realizing that they have to play a bigger part. And similarly, the healthcare departments and the public departments are realizing that there are lots of things that tech can offer. And the question is, how do you sort of bridge the gap between the two? And it takes time, it takes patience, it takes understanding. But I think that's exactly the right model for things to move forward.
I absolutely agree. And interestingly, when you look at London, there was a call made. They called it Digital Dunkirk, which was referring to a famous World War II battle in which small private ships were engaged to evacuate hundreds and thousands of Allied forces from Dunkirk, France. So they actually referred that particular battle because they said, "Come on, private sector, you need to rescue us again." And they called it Digital Dunkirk because this is, I think to some extent, like you said, we have hundreds of heroes right here in Santa Clara County, employees that are battling this, working pretty hard. We have the Valley Medical Center, our frontline warriors, nurses, doctors, who are essentially putting their life in line. I mean, many of the nurses did not have these masks, and they would get up and go to work daily. I mean, they didn't have the N95 protection. So kudos to them, right? I mean, we have some amazing heroes in our midst. But I think it's an opportunity that we have to figure out what we can do to create this close synergy between the public and the private sector. And apparently, when I read what happened was, there were N95 manufacturing facilities that were willing to make those masks, and our governmental agencies, not from here in California, basically declined that. And which is like really sad. I think we need to understand the gravity of problems, and we need to put aside whatever beliefs we have, because at the end of the day, we have to protect the people. I call it, people-centric behavior. If you can apply that with every single problem, we just cannot go wrong with creating good solutions from that. So let's go back
Can I add another point to that?
Yes.
So one of the other things I've been thinking a lot about is supply chain, right? So over the last several years, in fact, maybe decades at this point, there has been such a focus on just-in-time supply chain optimization, right? And that's served the economy and companies and individuals really well, because everyone loves getting their next day shipping from Amazon, or now they want same day shipping, now they want 1 hour shipping. So you can't deliver that unless and until you have a massive investment in supply chain and efficiency. But the flip side of this is, I don't think our supply chains have resilience. And this is what COVID-19 showed us, was that if everything is just in time, what that ends up happening is, if one of your chain breaks, you have such a massive backlog that you don't have a fallback plan or a business continuity for anything. Like we saw this in masks, we saw this in PPE, and we also saw this, with manufacturing in countries outside of the United States. So I would imagine that that's an area of constant discussion among many executives at this point, both public and private. Like, how do we build a more resilient supply chain and yet not pass the cost down to end consumers? And that's, I think, a very interesting technological, operational complexity, policy kind of challenge, because it's not only about optimizing the supply chain, it's about, where do you put the manufacturing? Where do you put the freight forwarding, and how do you get it in front of consumers? And I think that would be an area which, coming out of COVID-19 with the introspection, I suspect that people will look at it more deeply.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. I think our supply chain definitely needs a close analysis. And as a fallout of this will be a much more robust supply chain system. And in fact, what we are also talking about is different aspects of the American economy. When you look at drugs, 80% of the raw material came from China, and we were completely reliant upon them. And there is talk about resiliency being created by building a self-reliant American system. And it's essentially a national security issue now, based on what we have seen. So there'll be a lot of changes that will happen over the next year, couple years, and it'll all be good. So let's go back to the transportation. So earlier, what we were hearing, Manik, was that with transportation, people would sort of prefer to drive cars or take Ubers, and not mass transportation. And but there is a huge transportation challenge we have here, because let's say if you stop the carpooling, if you don't take the BARTs and the Amtrak or whatever else we take, Caltrain, we'll end up clogging the roads. And let's say, March of next year, and we have 0 cases and everything is a roaring economy. We'll have clogged streets, because people might still be paranoid. It'll be hard for people to shake it off, and there'll be resistance in jumping into a train. So how do we deal with that, right? So, we were talking about last year, we had built out a policy agenda with creating housing in different parts of Bay Area, not only in the 9 counties, but also in the mega Silicon Valley region, which is about 21 counties, as far away as Yuba City, all the way to Monterey County. And if you connect all these cities with high-speed transportation at the scale of like 700 miles per hour, perhaps, you would drop the commute time to 21 minutes. So we talk about the 21 minutes to 21 counties. And so with the is there an opportunity now, based upon been at Uber and the investment that Uber did with also companies with fleets to ensure that Uber is well equipped for the world of the future. And what we also talk about is the fact that many of us will stop owning cars in about 10 years because our cars sit in the garages and they are only used like 6%. But what if we created a system, the last mile with autonomous cars, and then you have high-speed transportation, and that would sort of make our transportation also zero greenhouse gas. Any comments on that, Manik? Have you given this some thought?
Yeah, no, I've definitely given this thought both at Uber and even after that. I think there are a couple of themes that I've been thinking a little bit about. Again, it's very hard, just like anything. I mean, this is obviously pretty hard to predict. But if you look at the way people are introspecting right now with COVID-19, the first question that I've been thinking about is what happens to cities, right? If you look at one of the most important trends over the last several years, it was decades really, is about the urbanization, right? So you had in the United States there were suburbs, and then of course there were a lot of people moving to suburbs because that's where the kind of the advent of the automobile and the personal independence of an automobile came about. And then there was a big shift towards cities as kind of high density places where people can work and so on. I mean, you look at how many startups over here moved to San Francisco, right? For the same reason, right? Like it was a very city oriented thing. So I don't know if I don't know about this obviously, but like there is something to be thought about what happens to cities in general. Do people still want to live in cities because of the density and all the complexities that come with living in a city in a pandemic kind of situation, the costs that are associated with the city? So that's one question we have to kind of think through. The second question in my mind is what happens to work, right? A large chunk of our traffic that we talk about, a lot of traffic planning that happens is around commute, right? So if we are going to be working more from home and or remotely for that matter, is this just a temporary thing because of COVID-19, or is this going to be something permanent? Like Twitter, Jack Dorsey has already said, if you're a Twitter employee, you can choose to work from home forever. May not apply to everybody, but maybe a chunk of people can do that. Google and Facebook are saying that probably they don't want their employees back through the end of the year. At least that's what I'm hearing. So to me, what is the nature of work, right? So like, is it remote or not? Because we have to kind of think about those trends and then connect that in a post-COVID world. And I really hope there's going to be a post-COVID world soon enough. In a post-COVID world, we have to connect that to how would people move around, right? So in my perspective, I feel that if there are chances where people either work from home more or exclusively work from home, suddenly the dynamic of owning a car is very different, right? You don't really need the car. Like, back at Uber, we used to look at, if you have to disrupt private car ownership, what are the things that people need their car for? Among the top things was commute, right? So there's commute. Of course, you want to go to the grocery store, you want to, go for a drive somewhere, you want to go on a long trip with your family and so on. If you look at, like, let's say there are 10 use cases of a car, and then you start unbundling each of them, right, over time, that was kind of Uber's thesis, right? So we had a product for each of those sort of aspects, if you will, by and large. So to me, if the future of work is a little bit remote, and at the same time, you have maybe people not wanting to live in big cities, and again, these are very speculative, I would argue that car ownership over the next 10 years, 15 years is actually going to go down. Because then you suddenly have fewer reasons why you need a car. If groceries can come to you at work, at home, if you don't have to work 5 days a week in the office, and maybe let's say you have to do that 3 days a week, you can use, high-speed transit, or in future, or you can use Uber or some other service to commute, and that automatically starts reducing your need for a car. So I think that's kind of how I think about it. Now, in terms of your specific point about high-speed transit combined with last mile and so on, I think that's super interesting. I apologize, I haven't seen that proposal before, but I would imagine that a typical sort of hub and spoke model always works, where you have a lot of people kind of aggregating in a certain place, going somewhere together, and then having the spokes go out. And that is where, whether it's an autonomous car, whether it is, even the last mile micro-mobility options with bikes and scooters and all these sort of new form factors, I definitely think that there is a lot of value in exploring those. But I think I'm still kind of thinking through a little bit more about the future of work and the future of cities, because I think those will have bigger shifts around any of these decisions we make.
Yeah. So, just to touch upon that, Manik, there has been a push now in California to essentially build high density housing by transit centers with bills like SB 35 and SB 50. SB 50 didn't proceed forward, but SB 35 has been applied in lots of different cities because the push is to build housing. But these housing projects are essentially high density housing projects. And we have seen the issues with high density housing. So to some extent, when I look at right now, sitting here in this coronavirus world, we see a shift happening where people will not want to live in high density housing, and they will want to be far flung in the suburbs, in the wilderness perhaps. And as long as they can work using Zoom or whatever else collaboration tools. In fact, there are new collaboration tools that will emerge in the next year or so. And that will make it a lot more easier for employees to be sitting, wherever they are and be part of a rich ecosystem or part of tech companies here in Silicon Valley. So that's going to be the natural evolution. In fact, Manik, you and I should grab coffee sometime, hopefully in that post-COVID-19 world.
Yeah.
And if you look at my website, rishikumar.com, and you search for 21 minutes, 21 counties, there's a nice search bar which works it's very effective. You'll find that paper. And we are essentially talking about a world of the future right here in Silicon Valley to spread the housing, because why clog up the traffic here? We already have issues. Why build more and more housing here? Let's push the housing out, but also build out a high-speed transportation grid. So I believe this is the time for investment. And so I talk about being bold, being creative. It's not the time to be wimpy. We have to make some bold stroke moves, which is what every leadership, in companies, they are looking to do that. And we have to build a future which is much more prosperous compared to what we had before in 2019. We have to sort of see how we can make it so much better by investing in infrastructure, housing, education, healthcare, and building a self-reliant economy. So now let's talk about from you wearing your product hat. You are the chief product officer of Uber. And if you were the chief product officer for America's future, what are the 3 products or investments that you would like to see come alive? How would you envision building out this future of America as the chief product officer?
That's like a pretty interesting question. So I think, you kind of mentioned a few things which I've been thinking a lot about as well. I think first and foremost, because of the project that I've been working on, I've just gotten really, really fascinated with what's happening in the healthcare space. And I think there is, and I know this is very cliched. Like every few years, some technologist comes in and says, I'm going to disrupt healthcare, right? And then they just fall, right? Because it is just so hard and it is so difficult to do, and you need the patience to be able to make the changes. But I think I've been thinking a lot about like, if I were to build a product around healthcare, I would build something that really puts the end consumer in control. Today, I feel that we have this whole secular trend of consumerization of the enterprise, right? So over many years, and this is not a new trend, it's been going on for a few years, you looked at all the enterprise tools, and then you basically applied a consumer lens to it. So all our tools that we use at office, for our normal work, they just became better. They were better UIs, better sort of patterns. They were lower latency. They didn't look like, old products, if you will. And I think if I look at the healthcare space right now, I think there is a lot of effort that needs to be put in to kind of have the consumerization of healthcare. Really put the customer, which is essentially the patient or the person who's getting the healthcare delivery, put them in the center, and then really build a set of solutions around them and really meet their needs in a unique way. Because if you do it that way, then you can kind of democratize the access much more effectively. You can remove the inefficiencies in the system. But again, like I said, I want to qualify this. This is a massive, massive challenge because there are just so many different stakeholders with entrenched interests and stuff like that. But this is where leadership is needed. We need leadership from the top to say, you know what, we are not going to go through a pandemic like COVID-19 ever again. We have to have a very strong focus on the end user. What do they need? How do we provide them access? How do we build a set of products? How do we integrate the technology so that everything kind of just works and we are delivering better outcomes than we are right now as a nation? So I think that there is a lot of exploration within that space that at least I've been thinking about. from a small vantage point, if you will. The other one that I've been thinking is education. And you mentioned this as well, right? You look at what's happening to universities right now, right? All of them are going through, both Cal State and the University of California system have announced that they are not going to open the campuses in fall. Now, if there are other universities out there, they'll also have to make similar choices because they have to prioritize safety and so on and so forth. So the question then is, how do we really look at a new learning model, right? Is there a different model that can be deployed? Maybe it is hybrid, maybe it is part online, part on campus, whatever the case might be. And if you can deliver education and especially higher education in a way that reaches more people, and again, you democratize the access to these universities in a big way, where people don't have to pay so much money to attend this because there's just so many more people who can attend the class. Now there is not that much competition that only 1,000 people can be in a class. You can have 10,000 people in a class, and there is a way and infrastructure you can teach that. Suddenly you have broadly improved everyone's life's outcomes because now they have a better education because they can afford it, and nobody's graduating with crippling amount of debt, right? So what kind of products do you build there? How do you get the professors who are extremely busy people, right? How do you make it easier for them to connect with their students? How do you give students and faculty and all the other sort of collaborators the comfort that they are part of community, even though they might be doing it from distance? So I think there's a lot of interesting things to be built over there. Of course, this is not new. You have all these online sources like Coursera and Udacity and all these groups are there, and even Harvard and everybody has put out courses online. But I think this trend can accelerate quite a bit, I feel, given the situation, because nobody will have a choice, right? It's not so much about can I do one way versus the other. If that is the way for the next, let's say, a year, what can we build around that to make sure that this becomes somewhat sticky post COVID-19, and then people actually prefer it because users say, this is actually the right way to do it because it just works for me. So that's sort of the other aspect. And then third, I talked a little bit about supply chain, but just generally e-commerce and how logistics networks work. I've spent quite a bit of my time and my career in this space. And I really think that on one hand, you have these massively always increasing customer expectations from e-commerce and delivery, right? Like I want everything, it started with a few days, now it's 2 days, and it's 1 day, and now I want it in a couple of hours. And I think at the same time, you have all these local retail, which is getting massively disrupted because they don't have the tools and technologies to play in that space. So what is the connection between local retail, between people living in a community? How do you sort of connect those dots better so that maybe those products can be discovered better and people are able to meet their needs more locally? And the emphasis on community and the emphasis on I'm part of a neighborhood. I really want the neighborhood to thrive. I want my family to thrive. I want my neighbor's family to thrive as well. I think there's something there because COVID-19 has made us more introspective about the community aspect, that we are all in this together. So how do you really build an ecosystem where you can deliver e-commerce products in a way which makes sense and it's much more, meeting users' expectations and at the same time having a resilient supply chain. So I think those are the three areas that I feel that there needs to be, significant investment. Now, I don't know if all three are America level priorities, because that's the question you asked, but I do feel that they're very close to an individual's viewpoint in terms of how they think about their lives. And it will be interesting to see what kind of comes out of this.
Yep. And, healthcare, supply chain, education, they would definitely be in the top 3, top 5 of American priorities. If there was some talk, I wonder, I think it was probably in one of our podcasts, we were talking about university professors. I mean, some of them are so good that why restrict them to that particular university?
Absolutely.
Allow them to freelance their offering and take them global, because they're so good that students can benefit in every part of the world. And it's an opportunity for them to create their own franchise or something like that. So I think this online world will shift quite a bit of new offerings, new technologies, and make it a lot easier for us to do certain things. And to some extent, for example, my wife really loves the workout, and she goes to the, every like 3 or 4 times a week, she's there. And then they started this Zoom workout. And when I first heard that, I would be like, who would do the Zoom workout, And here she is every day. She was just working out for like a good 45 minutes, as I was getting ready for this one, so the people adapt, people, they make it good, so that's the story, how to play out. So we have a few folks who have joined it. Let's see if we have a few questions that we can get that started. Dave, yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I don't want to jump the line here. I think Ashvin and Somnath had some questions, but I mean, it's interesting. We talked a lot about Uber in this conversation, without a doubt. And it's really intriguing thinking about how for the last, let's call it decade, maybe half decade, we've seen businesses try to mimic the Uber model, right? Whether it's, direct competitors like Lyft, or for that matter, in other industries, like I think of TaskRabbit locally, right? And just kind of find little niches here and there. So, I think it's interesting now we're seeing sort of this, this change in opportunity, right? The delivery world obviously is coming in many different facets, healthcare included. I was just curious, where do you see those sort of Uber-like models, sort of the gig-based model, if you will, kind of parlaying into this sort of post-COVID world?
Yeah, so I think overall, there is clearly enough consumer demand right now for models like this, right? Yes, there is a temporary blip in terms of whether people are going to get into an Uber or not, and I'm sure people are still concerned about having people come to their house for whatever service that they were getting earlier. But if you look at in general, there is a lot of pull from customer demand on at-home services or on-demand services. And if you really boil down Uber or companies like Uber, it's really about creating a marketplace of buyers and sellers, right? And how do you create that marketplace in the most effective and efficient way so that you can do that matching where you match the right buyer and seller, and there is a clearing price which makes sense, right? So a lot of these, a lot of these companies, as they find these niches, I mean, you look at what's happening to Instacart right now, for instance, right? They have seen, like, I don't know, I heard a crazy stat the other day that it's like almost, multiple 100%, increase in their orders because everybody's sitting at home and ordering groceries. So, and they're hiring like almost 1 million people, 750,000 in the first batch and then 250,000 later. So I think this is here to stay. And I think over time, there will be probably some consolidation in the market, just like happens in every company as they become big or small, or, some things change. But this is a global phenomena. There is a future of work kind of conversation that people are finding new ways to make money as opposed to be tied to a particular job. They want to have different optionalities, and they can do this part-time, which has always been one of the most important facets for a company like Uber, where a large chunk of the drivers and couriers are all doing this part-time because they have so many other things going on in their lives, and this gives them the flexibility. So I think there's a future of work component, and that would always allow, if you combine the future of work, which is a supply, and you combine the customer pull, I think there are lots more businesses that will continue to do well in this direction.
Yeah, I agree. And not to suggest it's a leading indicator, but don't take any more breaks. We can't do any more pandemics.
I will keep that in mind.
That's true. It's tied to Manik taking a break. So, okay, let's go to Ashwin. Ashwin has a question. Ashwin, would you please unmute yourself and ask the question?
Hi, Rishi. Thanks for the great session. Good to meet you, Manik. Is that new project you talked about, is that non-profit, volunteer-driven? And a second part of question is that there are already a lot of contact tracing apps on at this Apple App Store. And what do you think are the gaps, opportunities for startups with respect to apps?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So yes, the project that I'm working on right now, we've already established a 501c3, so it's a nonprofit. We were very clear from the beginning that that's what we would do, so that there is no confusion in terms of where we want to take this. And we have a bunch of volunteers. It's about 20 people who are currently working on this. And most of them are people me and my co-founder, Brian, we have worked with over the last several years. So, people from Google, Uber, Waze, and all these companies that are very familiar to most people. So we have that. And in terms of contact tracing, yes, you're right that there are a lot of contact tracing kind of apps right now, but all of them struggle with one very, very basic problem, which is I don't think that they're prioritizing privacy enough. And I've worked on location technology for many years at this point, back at Google and also at Uber. And I can tell you that any app that uses your GPS location, especially to kind of record that and keep that in a central database, it's very, very personally identifiable, even in a crisis kind of scenario. So that is why when I saw the Google and Apple solution come out, which is Bluetooth based, and it doesn't really record any of your personal location characteristics, I was very impressed. And I think that will be the model. It came out just in April, so it will take some time to get adopted. And contact tracing, as Rishi was saying earlier, is just getting started in many states in the United States, including in California. So I think there will be a new wave of apps that will essentially integrate that API, partner with some states or counties, and deliver that. Already Germany, Italy, I believe, and even the UK is reevaluating, but all these countries at a country level, they're building apps that are going to use Google and Apple's technology, and I think that's going to be interesting. As far as we are concerned, contact tracing is just one part of what we are offering. What we are really building is essentially a suite of applications that help counties, businesses, and individual users in a community do their part to really safely reopen society. So there's an aspect of a user's personal health status with regards to COVID-19. There is a sort of a dimmer switch approach that we're giving to counties to dial up or dial down the access that they want for various people in a particular location. And then for a business, the incentive is that if you're really doing this access control of people coming in with a certain health status, you are getting better and better, validity of your own safety for your employees and for your customers. So that's sort of the three-sided kind of approach that we are building, and contact tracing is one of the modules within that. And we have set this effort over the last, just coming to a couple of months now, and we have a pilot customer already, and we're going to deploy that in early June, and we'll see how this survives in the wild, and based on that, we'll see what we want to do next.
Is there a website or somewhere to know when you make the announcement?
We are launching. We are going to launch sometime next week. We haven't announced the details yet because that was kind of our lowest priority. Our priority was to just get this out, and I've just been blown away at how. Again, I'll stop talking good things about my own team, but it's been pretty amazing to see our engineers build the consumer app, the admin console, the manager app, all that in like matter of 4 weeks from ground up, and we are ready to go. And it's been a fascinating journey to get my hands dirty into product again.
How do we come to know of it?
I'm sorry?
In your announcement, email or something that we can come to know?
Yeah, I will be, when I announce it will be on my Twitter. So please follow me on Twitter or on LinkedIn. Just send me a request, and we will cover this in the media as well.
Okay, so, Manik, that sounds really exciting, and I'll be looking forward to that announcement. I'll be watching out for it. Let's go to Preeti Sharma.
Hi, Manik. How you doing? Good to see you and good to hear you here on this platform. My question for you, Manik, is that I can't see you here right now, but the question is that this is so exciting what you're working on right now and what you're embarking upon, and truly the need of the hour. What's the biggest challenge that you're facing right now that kind of you can foresee as the biggest hurdle for taking this product to fruition?
Yeah, so I think the biggest challenge we are facing is, or we will face, and we are already facing, is what's the go-to-market, right? We are all consumer people, so we have built consumer apps, and I've been part of a journey where I built apps that are used by 1 billion users, which is just amazing. But I am struggling right now on how do I deploy this, because it's a three-sided kind of model. How do I deploy this with a county? How do I deploy this with an end user? And how do I deploy this with a business? And all three have to kind of come together, otherwise the system sort of doesn't work. So that go-to-market is something we are spending a lot of time on. So that's why we are looking at doing a pilot, and we learn from it. And then we can go multiple ways. One way would be we just go full consumer and we put it in the app store that anybody can download. Another way would be we just go through large employers or large sort of governments and say, you need to kind of communicate this out. So those are new skills that I'm learning in terms of how to think through this. But that's really the biggest open question for us right now.
Good set of questions. Thank you, Preeti. We have far exceeded our 60 minutes. I know Manik is a busy man. So let's get through a couple more questions. Want to make sure that every question is addressed here. Let's go to Somnath, who's asking about supply chain and with Uber. Somnath, are you still around?
Yes, very much. Thank you, Rishi, and thank you, Manik, for your insight. I mean, fairly exciting insights have come in. I live in India, Gurgaon, and we have seen Uber being more of a B2C company, B2C brand. So your thoughts, you mentioned about supply chain management. Your thoughts on, Uber or the likes, diversifying into B2B supply chain. So, I teach in multiple business schools in India. So that really is some time. So that's, I wanted to inquire with Manik. Your thoughts, Manik?
Yeah, no. So I think I don't remember the name of the products. I'm just, you can Google it essentially. But Uber did recently announce a move in somewhat of a B2B supply chain where you can ship products from one place to another. You can essentially order an Uber and it will come to you, and the driver will come, and then you can just put a package in their boot, and then they'll take it to whoever you want it to send to. So this is essentially more for consumers initially if you want to send something out, but I can totally see that being used for local delivery and so on. So I think this has been something that the company has thought about previously, but especially now with contactless delivery, with a lot of curbside pickups and all those things coming up, I would imagine that this is an area that the company is going to focus on. So yes, it's going to happen in that direction.
Okay, thank you. I'm already following you on Twitter.
Okay, thank you.
Very nice. Good. Okay, couple more quick ones. Let's go to Amita. Amita, would you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, hi Rishi and hi Manik. So my question is instead of testing everything from scratch, how quickly we should be learning from the practical models which are already working absolutely fine all over the world. So another point I want to add to this is there are 100 startups, so out of them 50 fail. So instead of struggling with the ideas, why don't the ideas come from the leaders so that they are sure shot success?
Yeah. So on the testing one, I don't think the goal should be that we need to test everybody. But honestly, right now, I don't think we're still testing enough. So I was happy to hear, Rishi, you mentioned that maybe the criteria for testing is actually evolving, so it's becoming looser, so more people can get it. I think that's fantastic. But in general, at least from my understanding, the tried and tested model really is, you test, you trace, test, and isolate, right? So that's the technique that Taiwan has followed, Singapore has followed, Germany has followed. And almost all of them have deployed significant amount of testing together with contact tracing, and then isolating those people who are infected so that they don't spread. And that's how you manage the R0, which is essentially the reproductive rate of the virus. And as long as you have that below 1, you are essentially controlling the virus. If it's below more than 1, you're still spreading it. So I feel that, to your point though, there might be other techniques that other countries are following. I'm not fully familiar with them. But by and large, at least from what I've seen, having access to rapid testing and more prevalence of that is one of the key enablers for any economy to fight the virus. And I think your second question was around startups and how can, I think what you're saying, if I understood correctly, is why can't we start with ideas that are more top-down? Maybe you want to expand on that a little bit?
Right, yeah. So that's what I meant. Yeah.
So I think I would say that it's really interesting, at least in my experience, more often than not, the best ideas have actually come bottoms up than top down, because people who are working, especially if you're an engineer or if you're somebody who's working on the front lines, you actually know what needs to be fixed and you have ideas around it. So I think that kind of process of getting the ideas from the bottoms up in an organization or in general, I personally have seen higher success on that. But the top level strategic initiatives, this is what Rishi and I were talking about earlier, there has to be strong leadership to kind of say, we are going to go into healthcare, we are going to go into education, we are going to go into supply chain, and here's a vision. I think leaders can do a very good job setting the vision, and the actual ideas underneath it. Typically, if you have smart people working on the front lines, I think they kind of have an understanding of what they can do, but they need latitude and they need air cover from leaders who provide the vision so that they're not afraid to take that chance. And I think that combination is the one, at least in my opinion, works really well. And I feel that we don't, unfortunately, always have the right leadership and vision to set audacious goals for people. And people always step up if they believe in the audacious goal. It's unbelievable how hard people work and come up with ideas if they know there's a vision that they're going after.
Absolutely. I think, Manik, you make a really, really good point, because it's very important for elected leaders, for our public policymakers to understand their customer, which is the people. And in fact, it's not the customer, it's actually their boss. Our elected leaders need to understand the mindset of their boss, and they better be reactive to, they act accordingly based upon situations to come up with solutions that will address the needs of the citizens, and this is where I think we are sort of lacking right now with our elected leaders, having a different set of priorities, or really not having a handle over, what is really needed, and all this bickering. And this is frankly a time where we need to do some soul searching and come up with a better plan. So if you look at, for example, testing, let's look at the stats on that. We have had about 10 million total testing done in the United States, with about 1.5 million positive, and so which works out to roughly about 15% positive. And when you look at the county, for example, we have tested about 43,000 people, and the positive rate is about 5.4%. So it's a lot less, lot more false tests, false positives is what has emerged with all this testing. So to some extent, I think, 10 million cases, 10 million test kits that were deployed for this testing is actually pretty good, but it came a little slow. And I wish we had sort of gotten our act together back in like January or February, but no harm there. I think, it's very important to look at the future story and see how we can carve out a policy. I mean, forget about, hindsight is always 2020, but what can we do to ensure that we are adapting and adjusting to create a new world of the future where a pandemic like this will never bring America down to its knees? So that would be something that I'll be looking for. Let's go to Nimish, last question from Nimish.
Yeah, hi, Manik. Thank you for your great insights. The question I have is, how do you see the social distancing and contactless aspect impacting the economy and changing the behavior? I think we talked about Uber in terms of getting in the car. People will be concerned about who has been there before me. How fast can it be infected before I can sit in there? What am I gonna catch if I do not know? And how do I then transact and interact with people in this new world? What are your thoughts? What kind of technology, what kind of behavioral changes that you would anticipate?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just going to be odd for a while, right? Like it's been interesting. This whole concept of social distancing, and people have figured out how to kind of make that happen to a certain extent. I saw, there's so many pictures that come out from different parts of the world where children are playing socially distant from each other. People are queuing up to buy groceries, and they're 6 feet apart and so on. So I think overall, what my thinking on this is, if you really look at large events as an example, whether it's a sporting event or concerts and so on, I'm pretty bearish on that. I don't think we go back to any of these anytime soon, because it's going to be very hard to have people, like it will just not be cost effective for the person who's running the venue to have people like sit 6 feet apart and have like 2 or 3 seats empty between them, right? So this is going to disproportionately impact some businesses that just depend on high density. And if that high density is not there, then it becomes unproductive for them because they don't make enough revenue. So that's going to be one challenge. And in general, I think from a consumer behavior standpoint, it's interesting. Like one of the cultural things that I noticed is in the U.S., people have this stigma against mask wearing. Right. When I used to live in Singapore at that time, like it was pretty obvious and pretty normal for people to show up to work wearing a mask. And they would do that because they were, they had a cold or something, and they will just come in and they don't want to transmit the infection to other people. And over here, of course, it has taken a little bit of coaching and time to have people wear that. So new behaviors are going to evolve in terms of how people, wear masks and how they talk to each other, how they maintain social distance. But at the same time, let's keep in mind that we are all social beings. So, any chance that we get where we get any semblance of, oh, it's safe, I think we will change our behaviors. I think state of Wisconsin yesterday, the Supreme Court in Wisconsin told the governor that his order was not implementable because it was, the shelter-in-place order was not implementable. And I saw some pictures from Wisconsin. Everyone is in the bar, right? And it's full. Like, it's like people are like drinking like there's no tomorrow, right? So I don't know, like it's what is going to happen with regards to, are people still going to have these behaviors for a period of time, or are they going to change it? Remains to be seen. But I think overall, this is going to be in the back of people's minds. And I think there'll be some people who will follow it, some people won't follow it. And that is going to be an ongoing experiment in this society.
Yep, for sure. Let's go to Rishi Yadav. I was referencing his predicament from a few weeks back, and he was here on this podcast, and we were talking about the whole small business stimulus package and how badly it was all choreographed in terms of the SBA website crashing early on. And then we had the PPP loans, the Paycheck Protection Program. Those loans were been offered by banks, but it was sort of done on a case-by-case basis and made it so excruciatingly painful. I think establishing close synergies, which is what you and I were talking about, Manik, earlier, between the public sector and the private sector can deliver a huge amount of bounty to the citizens, So Rishi Yadav, you want to jump in and talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think, I always say that anything worth doing should be, is worth doing poorly. I copied it from somewhere. So the whole point is that I think the way PPP came out.
Are you at Starbucks, by the way? I can see a bustling coffee shop behind.
Yeah, I'm at a Phil's, but I can go to Starbucks if you want.
Yeah, let's change. I prefer Starbucks.
Okay, let's support Starbucks. Okay, so I'm at Starbucks now.
Rishi, where is Lali? Come on.
Yeah.
I hope she doesn't find you here.
Oh, at Starbucks in the night. Yeah. So, but what happened was that, kudos to the government that they started doing it very fast, and it was a haphazard thing. There were a lot of issues. In fact, Rishi Kumar had a bunch of podcasts just related to that. But slowly now they are fixing it. They're coming up with more and more clarifications and things like that. They came up with the clarification yesterday itself that most of the employers who got below $2 million of loan, they are part of the safe harbor. They don't have to worry about the crackdown and things like that, right? So I think that's the overall theme. And we being in the tech industry, we know it, right? That we always make an MVP. We just get something which works, a bullock cart, and then we slowly improvise it in an iterative fashion. So I think the government also needs to adopt that thing. I think my problem with the government always is too many lawyers there. Now more and more people are talking about that, including Elon Musk, right? And a lot of talented people are getting into the law, which probably the worst place for them to be in, right? Because you're not creating anything there. So so those are my 2 cents. So.
Good, thank you. So Manik, we'll wrap this up. I'm so sorry we ran over, but this was a very good engaging discussion. So that's why nobody wanted to leave, and we are getting some solid insights from you. So thank you for doing that. So my final question is, in terms of your advice, as the product guru, what advice would you like to offer for budding entrepreneurs who are seeking to roll out products during this quote depression phase of the economy? We are not quite there, but sounds like we will be there. The Great Depression is what we're looking at, and nothing to be excited about, unfortunately. But this is the inevitable. So please, Manik, final few words from you.
Yeah, no. So it is obviously a pretty big cliche, but I do believe it, which is a lot of great companies always start when times are bad, because a few factors come together, right? And I'm seeing this in this current situation as well. Firstly, there's a lot of talent that's available. And it's really unfortunate that we are seeing a lot of layoffs right now. Obviously that's the companies are kind of figuring that piece out, but all those folks are very talented. They are, I'm sure, looking for the right next opportunity. So if you have an idea you want to work on, you will easily be able to attract the right sort of talent because people want to just go and do something. I also feel that people are in a mental state right now where they're just bored, right? They're bored of their daily kind of life, if you will. They're self-reflective. They're looking at their friends and family more. And I think they are probably searching for a deeper meaning. And one of the most exciting things that happen when you start a company or start an idea is you start with a passion, and then people suddenly find a new meaning in life. And I think that connection is something that can be very, very, it can be a big unlock for many people. So again, from a talent perspective, I think it's a great time to start something and have people join you. And as we discussed in this whole session, there are so many fundamental changes that are happening around user behavior. It's unclear how many of them stick because people don't change that often. But at the same time, there are certain secular trends that we are seeing. We talked about healthcare, education, supply chain, and a bunch of other topics. And I think it's a really interesting time to capitalize on that. I do feel there's going to be a lot more investment in a lot of these areas, whether it's public investment or private investment, it's just going to happen. And if you have an idea in that space, capitalizing on that with the right talent, it's actually a really good time to start. So I'm pretty bullish about that part of the future.
Fantastic. So that's a great way to wrap this up. We will always be bullish here in Silicon Valley, but I did want to draw attention to a comment from Nidhi, the better half of Manik, and she's talking about how the analogies between 1918 to today and how people even back then were resistant to wearing masks. So click on that link in the chat window and you can see how this is playing out. And I think we have to shed that, because if everybody is going to be wearing masks, we will essentially protect each other. But if one person is not wearing a mask, then that creates a risk for us. Integrate this as part of the American culture for the foreseeable future. So let's wrap this up. Let's key conclusions. We need change of hearts. We need our elected leaders to step up, create policies, create the air cover so that innovation can happen, that provides the ability for people to jump in, rush in, and work in specific areas that will be aided by these policy decisions that our elected leaders would make. We talk about tactical adjustments, in the context of Dara at Uber, with Uber Eats, it's working out really well. But also Dara is looking at the long term in terms of how the Uber business will need to evolve with autonomous cars, with the post-COVID-19 world and everything else. And this is what smart people are doing. And then, or for example, even creating new business lines, right? Adapting and adjusting so that you are ready for the world of the future. And then we also talked about unlearning and adapting. We have to unlearn the skills that we had prior to March. And then we have to learn a new set of behavior, a new world that has been defined as we speak right now. And we'll all have to adjust. The ones who will adjust the best will survive and will thrive. And then we also talked about the synergies between the public sector and the private sector with rolling out software solutions, but essentially, teaming up with the best in breed and making sure that we are creating a close synergy to help the people out. And then the top 3 areas that we talked, we asked Manik, as the Chief Product Officer of America, what are the 3 different product areas you would like to focus upon? And he talked about healthcare, supply chain, and education. So definitely, this is the time for us to keep innovating. And great words of insight from Manik. Thank you all for joining in. And I really appreciate all the questions, all the conversations. Enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thanks, Rishi, for having me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rishi.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.